Welcome to the Wellbeing Dialogues. Hello and welcome to the Wellbeing Dialogues, the podcast for minds that wander, wobble, and wonder, where we explore people, practices, and insights transforming how we understand emotional well-being, especially in children. I am your host, Jacqueline Klemke. I am a systemic couples and family coach, a mental health first aid trainer, and a mental health and well-being consultant. Today, I am honored to speak with Beth Tyson, a childhood trauma expert, psychotherapist, best-selling author, and a passionate advocate for trauma-responsive care. Welcome, Beth, and thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's an honor to be with you and spend this time talking about such important topics.
Now, let me first of all tell you a little bit about Beth. Beth is a licensed psychotherapist and the founder of Beth Tyson Trauma Consulting, where she teaches organizations, caregivers, and professionals how to create environments where children can truly thrive. Beth has a personal history to how she came into trauma consulting. Would you like to share a little bit about that? I think this is more genuine if you tell us your story as opposed to me reciting it.
I lost my mom suddenly when I was in my late 20s. She died suddenly in her sleep one night. And I had always been interested in psychology and mental health and found myself naturally gravitating towards those topics. But I was sort of afraid to take the leap and go into that type of work because I wasn't sure, if I could make a living or if I was really committed to it. But after losing my mom and experiencing my own symptoms of PTSD, loss and traumatic grief, I kind of came out of that whole experience with a deep, deep desire to help people the way I was helped along my journey through that. And so I, how old was I? 30, went back and got my master's degree in clinical counseling. And from there, my first job out of graduate school was working with children and families in foster kinship and adoptive homes. And that opened my eyes to a whole other world I didn't even know existed, but I could really relate to what the children and families were going through because of this deep loss that I had had. And so even though my loss was different than the children's losses, I could understand in a very visceral way what grief feels like and what those symptoms of trauma feel like in the body. And so, just became very committed to helping those families navigate adversity, trauma, loss with the things that I learned not only through my clinical training, but through my lived experience.
Now, trauma is a big word. Can we try to unpack that a little bit? And can you maybe shed some light on the different shades of trauma, I'm going to call that, because I don't want to say types of trauma. That would probably be too categorical. So why don't you go ahead and share your view of what trauma can look like?
Absolutely. So the trauma that I primarily work with and populations that I serve are struggling with what's called developmental childhood trauma. And this type of trauma takes place in early life, usually under 8 or 10 years old, before a child's brain is fully able to, understand the world around them and really process the types of losses, abuse, and neglect that they've experienced. And this type of trauma looks different than a car accident trauma or a house fire trauma. Those are what we would call single incident traumas, where there's one major impact, one major event. Most of the symptoms and memories are tied to that one singular thing that happened. That's one type of intense, difficult, and overwhelming trauma. But then you have the trauma of childhood, which is more of a chronic, ongoing assault on the nervous system of the child in a way that reinforces the fact that they are not safe and that they can't trust the people around them, the world around them, and even themselves to keep themselves safe. And so this is a different type of trauma, right? Like you said, a different shade. And it can be hard to even recognize in ourselves. Some people have been through this type of trauma and they don't recognize it as such, while others are very aware and they recognize that what they went through was traumatic for their nervous system. And the thing about trauma is that two people can experience the same exact situation, and one may have responses that are related to trauma and then another might not. And that is all dependent on whether the person just has like an innate resilience that they may have gained earlier in life, or maybe it's they have a really strong support system around them that sort of mitigates some of the impact of that trauma. So, everybody's response to life experiences are different, and nobody can say for certain, like, that's trauma, that's not trauma. And so I always like to put that in my definition because I think it's so important that, trying to put it into categories is difficult because everyone experiences the world differently, and one person can have a lot of trauma symptoms and then maybe somebody else goes through the same thing and has less or not many at all. So yeah, we're talking about like an ongoing chronic complex trauma that happens in childhood based on relationships with adults primarily. So it's usually a loss or an abandonment by a caregiver. It could be a neglect by a caregiver, a child who didn't receive enough emotional or physical care as a young child. It could be blatant abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse of the child. And it can be separations, such as child who has to go into foster care because of substance use disorder of the parents or mental health problems of the parents that they're unable to show up and provide for their children. So there's lots of different variations of the trauma I work with, but I'm focused on that early childhood period and the trauma that happens in relationships between children and adults.
Thank you for that. It's not an easy endeavor to take on when half of the world seems to be talking about trauma, depending which bubble you're in. So, what are potential signs and symptoms that you would see in a child experiences this type of developmental trauma?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different variations. Again, like it doesn't show up the same in everybody. Some can have many symptoms, some might have fewer. But what we typically see with children are of aggressions in development. So either the child was like making strides developmentally and then has some sort of setback where they are going back to an earlier version of their behavior. So maybe this is a child that was learning to potty train, now no longer is potty trained. Or maybe this is a child who was learning to speak but suddenly has lost their speech, and these can be caused by other things besides trauma, but regression in development is one of the red flags that we look for. Things such as hypervigilance, and a child who's very anxious and on edge is always waiting for or expecting something terrible to happen, very fearful of the world around them. That can be a common symptom of trauma. With very young children, it can look like frequent long tantrums and meltdowns that don't seem to have any solution, like it's not like, oh, the child's hungry, so they're having a meltdown. It's like, I've done all the things, I've fed them, they're clean, they're warm, they're loved, and like they're still really having these like longer than 20-minute meltdowns on a regular basis. That can be a symptom of trauma. And again, if you are recognizing any of these signs in your children, you know it all has to be assessed by a professional. So don't get too scared if you're hearing, oh my gosh, I'm hearing something that sounds like my child. These diagnoses take an assessment by a professional trauma-informed therapist or counselor. But those are some of the things we see. We also see troubles with sleeping, either sleeping more than usual or not enough. Troubles with feeding and eating, if they're having difficulties with that. There's lots of different types of behaviors that we might see, but there's usually a lot of aggression or shutting down. So a child who seems very angry is hurting themselves or others, is really acting out, won't get close to other people, is afraid of getting close to adults, or shut down, like being very sort of just off in their own world, not engaging with others, not communicating their feelings and expressing their needs. Again, it can look lots of different ways, but those are some of the most common presentations that I see.
Obviously, as you rightly said, differential diagnostics are there for a reason, and they are to be done by a professional. This is not asking any parent to diagnose their children in whatever form. And as you also rightly said, this can have different reasons. But if you see some of that, it might be caused by a challenge that you might not associate with what you're seeing, right? Yeah. All behavior is communication.
If it means if you see those things, get curious. Doesn't mean, jump off the deep end of, oh my gosh, something terrible happened to my child. But if you know your child has been through a divorce or a loss of some kind or is in foster care and you're seeing those symptoms that I just mentioned, that's where you kind of want to connect the dots more.
Right. Absolutely. Now, this experience with foster care children brought you also to author some books. And the main character is Sullivan. One is called A Grand Family for Sullivan, and another one is Sullivan Goes to See Mama. Would you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the idea of writing a book, what they're
Yeah.
about, and what they're trying to achieve?
Yes, thank you for asking. It's always a pleasure when I get to talk about my little Sullivan guy and his grandma because this is just such a big piece of my heart, like out in the world. I call them my book babies because that's really how much like love and commitment you have to put into bringing a book into the world, into fruition. So basically, what happened was, as a psychotherapist working with children and families, I often was working in homes with children being raised by their grandparents or another relative of some kind because their parent was incapable of keeping the child safe for any number of reasons. And there were lots of books that I could find for children in foster care or adoption situations, but I couldn't find any children's books at all for relatives who are raising children. And it's a different dynamic. If you're not familiar with it, you might think, oh, what's the difference? It's kind of all the same, isn't it? But it's not. It's very different sets of complexities when you are living with a grandparent or aunt or uncle because the biological parents tend to still be in and out of the picture. And there's just a lot of loyalty issues that go on in those families. And then you have the generation gaps, right? You have, someone who's in retirement, sort of ready to slow down their lives, and then suddenly they're raising a young child, and so the stress of that, um, and the way parenting has changed over the years. I mean, it's so much for them to take on. So I wanted those children being raised by grandparents and other relatives to feel less alone in their experience and have a book that would reflect to them their experience in the world. I think it's really valuable when a child can say, "Oh, that's like me. I've been through that, and I'm not alone. Sullivan went through this too." So the stories really focus on, helping children understand what it means to be a grand family, also known as a kinship family, and helping the child understand why they have to live with grandma or their relatives. Because that was the problem that I really came across in my work as a therapist, was that nobody was telling the children what was going on in age appropriate language. They were either silent, not talking about it and pretending nothing was wrong, or sometimes they would share too much information and that was, harmful to the child, and complaining about the parents and, telling them way too much information. And so I wanted to have families find more of like a middle ground and an age appropriate way to explain to children why they have to be raised and separated from their parents sometimes. And so that's the purpose of the first book. It's a trauma-informed story that helps children being raised by grandparents get the answers that they need in an age-appropriate way. And so it becomes that bridge between the adult and the child to talk about some hard things that the adults might even be afraid to talk about out of like fear of doing more harm. The second book was another topic that I couldn't find a children's book for. Like I saw a need and I'm like compelled to fill the gap. But the second book is called Sullivan Goes to See Mama. And I wrote that one because the first one was so successful. Everybody kept saying, when are you going to write a sequel? When are you going to write another one? We need this topic and that topic. And I just saw such a great need for it. And I thought, what can I do to help? What are the biggest pain points that I see? And one of the other big pain points I see in families in this situation is that they have to usually attend some sort of visitation or family time with the biological parents. And that situation is often very confusing, can be re-traumatizing for kids if it's not approached with care and gentleness and information. And another area where adults are afraid to say the truth of what's going on. So again, wanting to give the adults language while giving the child the explanation. And so this story really focuses around how do we prepare a child emotionally for supervised family time, is what we like to call it. And in a way that's, again, trauma informed and healing centered, so that the child can get the most positive benefit from those visits and time together versus coming home from the visit and feeling so confused and out of sorts that they're acting out. A lot of behavioral challenges after those visits are typical. To the point where, some of the foster and kinship families I worked with would say, like, I don't think they should see mom or dad anymore because it's causing them so much distress at home when they come back from the visits. And I thought, well, I can't possibly help every child in that situation, but I can give them a book that would at least ease some of the stress of their experience. Not going to fix it. It's not going to make it go away or solve everything, but it can provide that containment. That holding place, um, that will help them attend the visits more regularly and have more positive outcomes.
You mentioned language, adults not being able to find the right words. I am currently writing an info sheet for parents on how to talk to children about mental health to make sure they open up because they carry a lot inside of them. And it's not easy, but we can find the right words if we put ourselves in the shoes of the child. Now, both of these books have been very successful. What is some of the feedback that you've received from some of those families, most likely, or even
Mhm.
outside of those families,
Yeah.
that are in this type of situation?
Yeah. Well, that's the best part about being an author is that I get to hear from the readers. And oh my gosh, the letters I've gotten have broken me down into tears. A lot of them say or start off with, "How did you know? How did you know that this is exactly what my family needed or what my grandchild needed? How did you know that this is exactly the situation that happens in my home every day?" And, I'm like getting choked up. Just, it gives me the chills, because, I was there with those families and I saw it, but I was able to have a perspective a little bit removed, right? So I could see the dynamics and the pain and the confusion and the loss and the sadness all playing out without being, the one who's so emotionally deep in it that I got lost in the weeds. So I think, because of that perspective, I was able to really portray what a lot of children and adults are feeling that feels very familiar to them. So just lots of stories of how, they've seen such a change in their grandchildren because they finally feel seen and validated for what they're going through. Lots of requests from the children to read the book over and over and over again. Oh, this is my grandchild's favorite book. He asks me to read it every night and multiple times. It's like, and that's the thing about children is that they absorb information in small bits over time. And they need to hear the repetition of these stories over and over again in order for them to truly, truly absorb the meaning of it. And a lot of times adults just don't know that. I mean, I wouldn't know that if I wasn't if I wasn't a child trauma therapist. So, and I struggle to find words for my own family, for my own daughter. And so I've always turned to books to help with situations where I'm at a loss for words with my own child. So I really love hearing, the difference that it's made. And it's been a really beautiful, like, full circle moment when that happened.
So, will there be any more books?
I think there may be. I think there may be. Actually, I'm working on a book for adults. Um, I was approached by a publishing company, and they've asked me to write and publish a book on, the topic of trigger-free parenting. So, like, trying to address our own stuff so that we don't sort of pass it,
Projected.
project it down onto the children in our lives, trying to break that cycle of you know, dysfunction in our own families.
And that takes a lot of reflection as well, right?
Yeah. It's
Self-reflection, understanding your own patterns so that you know, oh, right now I get triggered by this because, or, something happened that day and you can't hold it together or whatever. Um,
yeah. Yeah, and it's not easy. I always say, like, if you're even if you just even shift, by 10%, you're winning, because trying to slow down your natural instincts and your gut reactions sometimes is feels almost impossible, and I've struggled with that myself as a parent. So, yeah, learning this concept of, oh, my child's behavior is hitting on something in me that's making me feel so angry, versus, oh, my child's just bad, or, trying to push my buttons, or, whatever it may be, manipulating me, or, whatever, like, conclusions we
right.
sometimes want to jump to.
Which
Um,
is usually
yeah. So I've had to learn that the hard way. And hopefully I can pass on, some skills and strategies for other folks to work through some of their own stuff so that we're not getting as triggered as frequently. We're still going to get triggered,
right.
but
Absolutely.
we can change the ratio, I guess,
Right.
is the hope.
Right. And I always find that, communication is the key. After like a long, hard day, I will come home and I tell my children, go easy on mommy today.
Yeah.
And over time, they've learned that that is code for stressful day or, go easy, keep it down, try
Yeah.
to be cooperative, try to support. They do, they
Yeah.
do respond to those types of cues,
Yes.
as long as we give them, right?
Yeah, I have done that as well. It's funny, we were chatting, saying that we both have children similar ages, and it took a long time, but I would say just finally this year now. And you have to use it sparingly, because if you use that all the time, then they're like, oh, I gotta go easy again, mom. It's like it gets worn out. But if you only use it when you really need it, I try to only use it when I really need it, and I'll just say, I'm having a tough day today. Can you just, like, take it easy on me, or, like, can we just try to think about what I've been through today, and I'm not feeling well, or whatever it is. And now she's at the point where she can have the awareness to say, all right, I guess so.
I'll
Now,
back
not every
off.
child is gonna have that, right? Not every child has that ability, especially if they've had serious trauma. Their behaviors uh aren't intentional. Usually they are very survival.
Impulse.
So, yeah, survival impulses. But I'm sure, for children like mine, who has had a mostly stable childhood, as stable as it can be in this world right now, um, even, making that communication of, hey, can we tone it down a little bit? I'm having a tough time, because they need to know that. They need to know that we struggle too. We can't keep up the veneer that we're, like, impenetrable through life's stressors. I show my daughter when I'm stressed out or upset about something. I've cried in front of her before, appropriately. I'm not crying on her shoulder, but I let her see me visibly upset, because what that teaches children is that it's okay to have a range of emotions, and that actually that's the healthiest thing. The healthiest people have a full, beautiful range of emotions.
Yeah. And that even parents are not superheroes, even though we're trying to
Right.
be, but we're not.
We try really hard. Trying really hard, but yes, it is just not possible. In fact, they need us to mess up. They need us to make mistakes, because we are human and they are human, and when we make mistakes, they learn from us how to make mistakes themselves, and that it's not the end of the world for them either. So, like, it gives them resilience to see us sort of, fall down, or make mistakes, and then they watch to see how we come back from that, right? And one of the greatest gifts I've been able to give my child is, I admit to her when I've messed up, or when I've lost my temper, or when I've done or said something that, wasn't my best self. And I go back once we're calmer and say, like, hey, I really don't like how I acted earlier. And I know I can't take away that moment, but I am sorry. And I'm going to try and do better next time.
That is actually the perfect transition to that LinkedIn post that I was referring to earlier,
Yeah.
because and you said in the post it said save it, and I did. So I followed the instruction. No, I saved it because I read it and I was like, "This is gold. This is going to be great for the podcast. I want to use this." So
Good.
what you just mentioned is what you called repair over perfection,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes. Yep. That is repair over perfection. It's impossible to be a perfect parent. Our parents weren't perfect. I'm not perfect. They're not going to be perfect parents. And they need to know when they have children, if they have children someday, that they can't be perfect either. Because, if they're putting all that pressure on themselves to be perfect all the time, because that's what they watched mommy or daddy do, we really haven't helped them navigate reality. The reality is we're going to mess up big time at this parenting thing. And the sooner they understand that and have eyes wide open going into it as parents themselves, the better off. So yes, repair, some people call it rupture and repair is another terminology. This idea that we're always going to have ruptures in relationships, whether it's with children, adults, whoever. But the really important part is, how do we repair after a rupture? Traditionally, parents didn't apologize to their children. I mean, that's, that wasn't a thing. That was looked at as, there's more the idea that we need to keep this hierarchy of, I'm the parent and I don't admit my mistakes and things. And I think that's based in fear. Like if I show my child this more vulnerable side of me, they won't respect me, or they're going to be bad kids. They're going to turn out to be delinquents or in jail, or, we go down this rabbit hole spiral real fast. When you're a parent, you just are so afraid that you're going to mess them up somehow.
It's this
And
Victorian style upbringing,
yeah,
absolute respect and fear. Everything's reigned by fear.
fear,
Yeah.
fear.
So I'm glad we've overcome that we've
Yeah, we're
become
getting
more
there.
human.
In some
Because
circles, yes, but in others,
yes, that's true.
it's
Right. Yeah.
still, I think in the mental health community, we've come around to it, but, I see people every day in my daily life. I catch, interactions just out in public where I'm like, "Oof, eesh,
Mhm. I
ah,
have the
they're
same
still
thing.
doing that. They're still saying that? We're still saying that. Okay."
Yeah. Where I just think, ouch. Really?
Yeah,
Did she
where
just
I'm
say
just
that?
like, I know, and, like, I don't wanna intervene,
No, of
you can't
course not.
tell me how to parent, especially if it's not a safety issue and it's just like a style
Yeah.
of parenting that I'm like, "Oof, okay, we gotta do more awareness building because some people still haven't received the message."
Right. Now, another one that you mentioned in the practices to double down on in 2026 was consistency. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So consistency, especially for children with trauma, especially for young children or children that have developmental delays of any kind, this is going to be your best friend. Consistency should be your best friend. And like the thing that you think of, the first thing when you wake up in the morning is, how can I make my child's day as consistent as possible? Consistency builds trust, because what is broken through trauma is the child's ability to trust themselves, the world, and the people around them. And it's our job as caregivers to help them rebuild that trust. And consistency is one of those ways. And, when we know what's coming next, when we know who we're going to see, when we know, what lunch time is going to look like versus dinner time, that helps settle the nervous system down, because there's some predictability. And the predictability is very soothing to our brains and our bodies, because then we can kind of, feel some sense of control over our lives. And that's often why we see children with trauma and young children having a lot of control battles, right? They want to fight with us, and they want it their way, and they, And that all stems from really from anxiety and fear and a lack of
A loss
control,
of control.
loss of control. And their attempts to gain it back are usually in not so pleasant ways for parents. And so when we can give them that consistency, it helps them feel more in control of their lives in a way that's okay with us, like, we're not it's not so uncomfortable for us and it's predictable for them. So, for example, I mean, life, look, is not always consistent, right? And things happen and people get sick and people quit and, there's all kinds of changes. Change is the one constant in this world, but there are ways that we can think ahead to make it more consistent when we know that there's going to be a rough patch or when something does go off the rails. One of the ways I used to do that and still recommend doing that is by, in the morning, just taking them through a very brief walkthrough of the day. So, we're going to have breakfast. I'm going to, you're going to get on the bus to go to school. You're going to go to school. You're going to come home from school. We're going to do homework. Then you're going to go to bed, whatever the daily, then you're going to go to sports and you're going to come home, just giving them a rundown. And if anything along that way changes and I'm not able to, I'll tell you as soon as I can, if I can. And if I can't, I'll make sure that I explain why and, try to keep things consistent for the next time. Um, because that's how our brains work. We feel safe when we know what's coming next. And when we know, even if things aren't going to be predictable, that there's someone there to catch us, and say, like, hey, I know that wasn't what you were expecting, but I'm here with you through it. And if I could have told you, I would have. And if I can next time, I will. That sort of holding environment is really, really critical for kids who have experienced trauma. So, yeah, that consistency, trying to keep the routines and structure to their lives when people are going to change, like say, a teacher is leaving their role or a daycare provider is leaving the daycare facility and they're not going to be coming back. Preparing the child in advance for that when you can, giving them an opportunity to say goodbye and letting them know that you'll be there with them through it is really helpful, as opposed to like, oh, so and so is gone and that's it. It's just like no announcement, no preparation, no opportunity to say goodbye, no invitation to grieve that loss. And for young children, those relationships are really important. Um, Try to be consistent, but when you can't, some preparation goes a long way.
Right. And that backup. I like using the phrase, I'm going to be with you every step of the way.
Right.
Not in the sense of physically with you, but I'm going to be there every step of the way. So like this reliable presence in their lives. And that's very soothing because a lot happens inside the brain, which I just briefly like to allude to. But you had something else that you called behavior as data in that slideshow. Could you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, and I think it's another way to say, like, behavior is always communicating something for children and people in general. There's usually a reason for the behaviors that we're seeing, especially in children with trauma, that we might not understand from our perspective as adults because we've sort of lost touch with what it's like to be a child. We lose that knowledge over time. But for example, things that can look very frustrating or annoying to us can actually be a way a child is coping with something that's really tough. So like one of the ones that comes to mind is humming, right? So I've posted on this before on LinkedIn and got a really, really like large response to it. But a lot of children hum in order to
Soothe.
self-soothe their nervous systems, right? But adults get annoyed with that. And other kids get annoyed with that. And so they are shut down and told, don't do that, stop doing that, be more quiet, blah, blah, blah. So, but that behavior is actually functional for them. It's actually keeping them from having a meltdown or having a aggressive outburst, or, it's allowing them to focus on doing their math problem or whatever it is. So I always try to say, like, find I know that's not always going to be appropriate for a kid to be humming if it's disrupting other children or the learning process in the classroom. I get that. But can we find other times throughout the day where it is okay for them to hum or to do whatever other sort of behavioral thing it is, as long as they're safe and they're not harming others? Why can't we make space for that instead of just shutting them down and telling them it's annoying to stop it, cut it out? It's like, oh, well, if you hear them doing it, just like let it go. Just let them do that. That's their body's natural way of soothing itself. But unfortunately, we've lost touch with a lot of that as adults. So that's what I mean by behavior can sometimes be um, a form of information, that, okay, well, you hear the child humming a lot in the classroom. Well, maybe they're not feeling very safe in the classroom. That's data, that kind of thing.
Can you just briefly explain what trauma can do to the brain?
Early life trauma, which is the type that we're talking about, sets the brain on high alert for threats. Basically, the brain learns. The brain is a prediction machine. The brain wants to learn from its environment and predict what's coming next so that it can survive. And the main goal of the brain is not love, happiness, food, excitement. It's survival. The main focus of the brain is to survive. So when a child or a baby or young person learns early in life that the world is not safe and that they are under threat of some kind, either through abuse, neglect, or just like having, angry parents, who are at their wits' end because of all the stress that they're coping with themselves and end up yelling at their children a lot. Things like that can communicate to the child's brain that they are not safe and that they can't trust to be taken care of by the people around them. And what happens is we're kind of setting the brain on to that high alert, to be scanning for threats, to be thinking about threats, and to be focusing more on survival behavior than relational behaviors. And survival behavior looks a lot different than relational behaviors. And yeah, so what we're having is like an early wiring, we'll call it, of the brain to be fearful. It's just like setting that fear alert off early, which then sort of plays out across the lifespan and creates all sorts of problems from there. Now, the good news is that our brains are highly, highly, highly malleable, especially early in life. So the earlier children get support and intervention for trauma and loss and any type of adversity, they have much higher chances of positive outcomes over the long term. So we're seeing that, the sooner we get them that help, the better. The more support and connections and relationships, healthy, strong, committed, loving relationships that we can wrap around a child, we can mitigate any of that trauma that was inflicted on the child's brain early in life. And so basically it's about helping the child feel safe again, and not just physically safe, but also emotionally safe in their world and in their own bodies. Um, and if you don't have that, then that's where things start to spiral. That's where you see people, acting aggressively in order to protect themselves and not connecting and attaching to caregivers, and pushing people away with their behaviors and things like that. So that's kind of how I like to explain it in a shortened version. Of course, there's a lot more that goes into it, and this is a simplified explanation.
Of course.
Um, but that's how I see it. And, the hopeful thing for me is that all the way through the lifespan, the research shows that our brains retain some malleability. So even if you're 80 years old, there's still the ability to change your belief systems, to change the way you think and behave. But the younger, the better.
Right. But in case you don't, your environment, your social environment doesn't pick up on this potentially being a trauma-related issue, and you carry it into adulthood, you can still work on that because
Yes.
of the neuroplasticity of the brain.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's some good news.
Yes,
It takes a
that is
lot of work, but it's
right.
possible, right?
It
As long
is.
as you understand and have someone that helps you understand the mechanisms behind it.
Right, right. And it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey. I don't think we ever get to a place where we're fully healed. I think it's something that we have to keep working on throughout our lifespan, almost like exercise, like if you let it go, your body's going to change. Well, if you stop working on your mental health, then your brain's going to change.
And I think it's become very clear that compassion and empathy, and above all, communication can be so central in making the child feel safe again. I think safe is probably the word you have used most often in the context of trauma over the past 40 or so minutes. Teaching the brain that it's okay. You can slow down. This is not one of those situations when your brain needs to freak out. It's good. It's all right, and having this calming presence in their lives is
Yeah.
probably essential.
Yes, and there's actually a phrase for what that's called. It's called a corrective emotional experience. And when we show up as caregivers with that compassion, with that care, with that honesty, and being able to be a safe, trustworthy person, we can help the child rewire their brain for that, to overcome the adversity they had. So every time we interact with a child, we can make a positive impact, and I think that's really hopeful for kids that have faced just some really terrible things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just one last thing, because we spoke about it and I almost forgot to mention it, is social media. And this is again something that could be covered in a separate episode and probably will be at some point. But anyways, social media, and like we spoke about Bondi Beach, we spoke about Minnesota, we spoke about what kids see on the news and what they carry inside with them. Can you just give maybe a recommendation or two for parents who might be struggling with what their child watched on the news and how to support them in the best way possible?
So this is a big issue, that's happening not only, for all children, but also in my own family, about how much they should be exposed to in terms of the news. And you and I were talking before the recording started about we have like a no news is allowed on in our households, because every time, even accidentally, the news gets turned on, the first thing that it says is, so and so was murdered today, and it's just like our young children and really teens, can't escape it all the time, but they don't need to be hearing this all the time. And neither do we. They pick up on our tension and our sadness and our anxiety. And if we're doom scrolling and reading all these articles and we're watching all of this horrific content, they are going to pick that up from us, because nervous systems are not a closed loop, they're an open loop. So we're always communicating with each other through our nervous systems, like through our moods and through the feelings and emotions that we're having. And kids are so perceptive that they pick up on anything that we're feeling. So I limit my own exposure to heavy content and to traumatic content. I limit my daughter's exposure. Luckily, I have the ability to do that still, because she's only 10, so I can really I use all the controls on her screens to make sure that she is not accessing that kind of thing. But if they do and they are exposed to this, we have to talk to them about that and be willing to have those hard conversations and check in with them about how they're feeling. Having media hygiene plan is important for families, to teach our children that we shouldn't be watching all of this really negative, horrible stuff all the time. But also that these are a reality, right? We can't stick our heads in the sand and pretend it's not happening. Like, our kids are going through active shooter drills and witnessing mass murders on a beach. Like, this is actually happening. And if we just like totally ignore it, that's not healthy either. So while I don't recommend immersing ourselves in that content all the time, I do think it's important that we are educating our children about the world and in bits that are sort of appropriate for them so that they're not all of a sudden shocked when they find out all these things go on either. It is such, I mean, we're really stuck in an impossible conundrum when it comes to
Absolutely.
this. Um, so yeah, so I think, it depends on the child's ability to handle the information. Typically, the older they are, the more information they can handle. If they're asking the questions, it's because they're usually ready to hear the answer. And that's kind of just a general rule of thumb. But again, it can differ from child to child. But yeah, I think it's important that we protect them when we can from too much, but that we're there to walk through them with them beside it. I mean, I tell my daughter that unfortunately there are horrible things that happen in the world, but you're safe here. You're safe in our home. I'm going to be here with you no matter what. We have a plan. If anything were to happen, here's our plan. Let's come up with a safety plan. And that's how I talk to her about the active shooter drills that we have to have here in America is which is just disgusting.
Yeah.
Um,
Horrible. Absolutely
I
horrible.
can't even tell you how distressing that is as a parent, let alone a child. But first of all, I keep her home on those days because the research does not show that active shooter drills actually prevent shootings from happening or save lives when shootings do occur. So because of her age, I've opted to keep her home on the days when I know they're having active shooter drills. Now she knows they exist because I told her and explained what they were and that there's a plan. Do I think she needs to be there to actually experience one? I don't think that the research supports that that's healthy for her in any way. It's more important that she knows follow adults, follow your
Instructions.
teacher's instructions.
Yeah.
If there's an emergency, whether it's a fire drill or active shooter drill, follow. If the teacher says, do this now, you know,
Yeah.
in an emergency situation,
Yeah.
you do it. And, and that's just my personal take on it. But, I I think it's important that we have these conversations with kids and not completely shelter them from it, but it has to be done it has to be dosed, I guess. It's almost like you have to dose them a little bit with some of the reality without overwhelming them as they get older.
Yeah. Yeah. And also in the teenagers that I work with, for instance, I find that if you don't have those conversations happening in parallel, also as they get older, they build up so much fear and distress, and because they can't really fathom what they're going to do if all that were to happen to them, and they build up all these thoughts in their minds, and we let it happen because we think, oh, they're teenagers. They have a grip on the world. Well, they don't, because they're actually in distress mode. They're in fear and, flight mode and fight mode all the time because of that. But thank you so much, Beth, for being on the podcast. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
I could talk to you forever. You've
Uh,
probably heard that before, but I think we keep it at that for today. And best of luck with whatever sequel or additional book you're going to write in the future, and also with everything else. And yeah, thank you again. This has
yeah,
been a true pleasure.
let's stay connected. It was a pleasure meeting you. Thank you for having me. You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Wellbeing Dialogues.